Thanks, and thanks Dale so much. I mean, the stock unit in general has just been fantastic. I'm an entomologist, so we just call him up on the phone, hey, can we do some weird stuff? And we come with our sweep nets and dung beetle traps and things like that, and they're always just so welcoming. So today I'm going to chat to you a little bit about harnessing dung beetles for both endo and ectoparasite control. So this is a quote that I came upon years and years and years ago, and it really struck a chord with me because I always used to feel guilty when my mom was weeding the garden and she's pulling out weeds and she's saying, oh no, that's a weed, that's a weed. And I always thought, well, just because it's not beneficial to you doesn't mean that it's not beneficial to someone, probably most importantly to itself. And so it really stuck with me, and I'm going to start off with this, that a weed is simply a plant that we haven't found its virtues for yet. And so this terminology that we use, we say, oh, this is a pest, this is a weed, this is a beneficial. These are all human constructs. The organisms are just doing what organisms do. So, unfortunately, our methods of farming create very specific niches, right? We farm one species of animal and quite intensely. So we form these really unique niches. Nature hates a void. If there's a void, nature fills in the void. So something fills that niche. This organism flourishes, and it's normally to the detriment of our product. And all of a sudden, we're upset because we've got this pest, right? We created the environment for it to thrive, and then we spend lots of time and money trying to get rid of it. It's kind of ironic if you think about it. So in our livestock production systems, what we can do is either create systems which encourage these pests to survive, or change our strategies a little bit and try and make it as difficult for them to survive as possible. And this is really what integrated pest management is all about, making it as hard as possible for the insects that you don't want to survive to be able to survive. So we're going to talk about 3 different kinds of pests in a little bit. And they're all pests that you associate with cattle that are out on pasture. And that's because when cattle are out on pasture, they're eating the grass, and that they're doing, they're pooping, right? So the first one we're going to talk about is hornflies. So hornflies, you'll know you've got hornflies if they're on the back of the animal, and when you get really high burdens, it can stretch over to the belly. And so these are musket flies. We're going to talk about another musket fly in a little bit, throw in a little bit of entomology terms here, get you guys used to some entomology. And so they always group together, they like to feed together, and their heads always point downwards. We don't know why, but their heads will always point downwards. And so each little fly feeds 20 to 30 times a day, every single day. So if you think about the fact if you've got 1,000 flies on you, each fly biting you 20 to 30 times a day, can really, really add up. And so what we really see is we see reduced weight gains, especially in younger animals. So you also see increased stress levels. You'll often find animals just bunching and stampeding, trying to get away from these flies. So they really are a problem, and economically, they cause the most damage, and we also spend the most money trying to get rid of them. And so if any of you have wondered what they look like close up, that's what they look like. You see that little biting mouth part? Really, really serrated, really, really annoying. And so this is the life cycle. What we normally see is the adult fly. But the eggs have to be laid in fresh manure. So the moment the animal poops, the female flies will go right off, lay the eggs, and go straight back onto the same animal. They're so attached to the individual animal. If you watch your group of animals and watch them move their heads, and you'll see that the flies rise up, and then they settle right back down on the same animal. So they really pick their animal, and they stay on that animal. There's 3 larval stages. They get sequentially bigger with each molt, but they really, really require fresh manure. So this is a pest that we get in pastured landscape. The second one that we're going to talk about is the face fly. And so you know you've got face flies because they're on the face of the animal. And so this is also a musket fly, so closely related to our hornfly. But where the hornfly bites, this one doesn't bite. It's got a mouth part that's kind of like a housefly. But that mouth part has sharp ridges on it, and what it does is it just scratches at the mucosal membranes around the eyes and the mouth, and it causes seepage of serum, and that's what they feed off. It's only the females who need this, and what they need it is for protein so they can lay eggs. And so why we're really concerned about this, other than the discomfort that they cause to the animals, they can vector bovine pink eye. So this can be transferred by direct animal contact, but even if you isolate an animal, let's say you have an animal and it's got pink eye, so you do what you're supposed to do and you isolate it. If you've got face flies in the area, that face fly is going to pick it up from an infected animal and move it to a non-infected animal. And this is a great picture of what the pink eye looks like. And so normally when we see these, we'll either see the females on the animal and they look kind of like houseflies, but at this time of the year, as we get into fall, they overwinter as adults. So you'll often see them on the side of buildings because they're trying to find little crevices to overwinter in. But just like our hornfly lays eggs in fresh manure, 3 larval stages, critical for the fresh manure. And then the last thing we have are gastrointestinal nematodes. And so this is just something that most cattle have. They tend to get acquired resistance as they get older, so it's normally young animals that are most affected by this. And these young animals are particularly impacted by roundworms. And so the adult animals do contribute to maintaining the life cycle, but here's the important part. The eggs are in the manure, they shed out into the manure, and those 3 larval stages all occur in the manure pad. Right? So again, same thing, you have the juvenile stage of this organism occurring in fresh manure. Okay, so what are we going to do about this? The real reason why we care is that for ecto and endoparasites, what we're seeing is this increased trend of them being less susceptible to the chemical control options that we're using. So what this is, it's a heritable trait, so it's in the genetic barcoding of these organisms. One organism gets it, it allows it to withstand the dose of chemical that used to be toxic to it, it passes it off to its offspring. And because we keep using the same chemicals, you're just selecting for that resistance to get stronger and stronger. It's important to note because producers always ask me, oh, well, do we have any new chemicals coming up? The first thing is we don't. But the second thing is even if we did, nature finds a way. The moment you start using a new chemical, nature starts adapting so that these organisms can survive this chemical. So resistance is inevitable. Unfortunately, when we use these chemicals improperly and just willy-nilly, it tends to accelerate this problem. And so really what we need to be doing is using integrated pest management to reduce how quickly this resistance develops and spreads. And so if we're honest, most of us have relied on a triangle like this, right? If you think about the size of the triangle as being the most amount of money and time you spend on something, most of us spend most of our money and time on applying chemicals, right? Every year I apply my chemicals, the flies come out, let me apply my chemicals. Maybe if you're super awesome, you have a good rotation. But for the most part, that's what we've relied on for the past 50 years. Maybe if we have the time or the money, we'll set up a few screens or traps. Maybe if we're really good, we try and remove the manure. And unfortunately, at least in veterinary entomology, there's very, very little that we can do in biological control. But what we really need to be doing is flipping that triangle over. So what we've done is we've gone and flipped the triangle over. What we really need to be doing is spending the most amount of time on these non-chemical interventions. And so what we're doing is moving from prevention, so spending most of our time and energy on prevention, and hopefully very little on intervention. You guys have heard that saying, a stitch in time saves 9? So what we're trying to do is those stitches in time, keeping the lid on all these ectoparasites and endoparasites before they actually become a problem. And so the great thing about this is we're limiting the amount of toxic chemicals we're using. So most people don't know this, but the chemicals that we use on our livestock are toxic to us, as toxic to us as the insects. The only difference is that their size to volume ratio is different to ours. That's why it's most toxic to little kids, right? So the amount that they're consuming is more than what it is for us. So these compounds aren't great for anybody. We still have to use them, but the idea is that we use them as little as possible. And so what we're going to talk about here is making habitat changes. So how can I make the environment as least favorable as possible to the organisms that I don't want? So for all 3 of these organisms that we talked about, I said fresh manure was critical, right? So if we get rid of the fresh manure, the life cycle is broken. A broken life cycle means less pests over time. And less pests means less reliance on chemical control, which means that when you do need to use it, you hopefully have susceptible populations that are going to be able to be controlled. So how do we get rid of all this fresh manure? We don't have the time to walk behind our animals with pooper scoopers, but what we do have is little dung beetles. And so dung beetles are nature's pooper scoopers. They're really little fun beetles. And what they're doing is they're reducing this breeding habitat for the flies. It's also reducing exposure to the gastrointestinal nematodes, and we'll talk why in a little bit. They're really great for reducing pasture fouling because they get rid of those pats, they distribute them. And also it's been shown that they are really good at integrating nutrients back into the soil. So not only are they good for controlling pests, they're just generally good for pasture health. And so we actually have multiple types of dung beetles. Most people know the dung beetles that they see, right? You see the one with his little ball as he's rolling it away. There's actually more complexity than that. What we do have is we have our rollers, and what they do is they take little balls of the manure, and they use their front little serrated legs to pat a nice little ball, and then they roll it away. Those are the ones we normally see. We also see dwellers. If you've ever opened up an old manure pat and you see all those little tiny beetles scurrying around, those are really important beetles. Those are your dwellers. And what they do is they bury the manure just below the surface. Tunnelers will bury it further beneath. And what they're really doing is and you can have all three types in the same manure pat, but what they're doing is they're taking that breeding source, that manure that those flies and those gastrointestinal nematodes need, and they're taking it out of their reach. And so what they're doing is they are a competition for these resources. They've also shown that they're really good at removing dangerous E. coli from manure pats. So they really do have a whole wide range of things that they do. And so we never really see this part because if you're lucky, you'll get to see maybe one or two of them rolling. But what they do is they lay an egg in an individual ball, and then that egg develops into a pupa. If you've been gardening and you see a grub, that's kind of what they look like. Beetles all have grubs that turns into beetles. They pupate, which is basically when they go off from their larval stage to the adult stage, and then an adult goes out of the little burrow and starts removing more poop. And so, unfortunately, we don't have a ton of research on how beneficial these organisms are. We know that they're beneficial, but it's really, really hard to quantify exactly how much. So this is an old paper. This was done in 1975. But what they saw is if they seeded pastures with dung beetles, they had 4 times lower the number of gastrointestinal nematodes in the cattle on those pastures. So without doing anything, no treatment, no nothing, just letting dung beetles be, 4 times fewer gastrointestinal nematodes. This has been followed up in 2017 where they found something similar. If we're looking at our horn flies, again, first paper was done in the 70s. They saw about a 90% reduction in horn flies, which is amazing. This was later redone, slightly later now, about 20 years later, and they only saw a 50% mortality rate. But still, imagine if you could get rid of half your horn flies without doing anything. That's actually a lot of horn flies. And so we're starting to realize how important they are, and we're also starting to realize where the gaps in the research are. So for us in Kansas, one of our biggest gaps is understanding who we have in the first place. The studies that were done a really long time ago, and they weren't really done systematically throughout Kansas. What we do know from some research that has been done is that dung beetles are active at different times of the year. So what you'll see during one time of the season is not what you'll see later. So dung beetles change. So if you go out into your pasture and you don't see anyone, doesn't necessarily mean that you don't have anyone. It just means that nobody is active in that pat at that time of day. What we do know is that the land use type can affect who you have in your ecosystem of dung beetles. So there's some preliminary data that's just coming out of Kanza Prairie that in areas in Kanza where they have cattle grazing, the dung beetle distributions in the population is different to where they have bison grazing. So dung beetles do have preferences for who they would like to have the manure from. But most importantly, how the land is managed will affect how your dung beetles thrive or fail to thrive. And unfortunately, a lot of the compounds that we use to try and control these pests can have negative impacts on the dung beetles. And so this is just to show you, this is a study that was done in North Carolina. Eventually, hopefully, we'll be able to do things like this in Kansas. But what they did is they looked at dung beetles in dairy units and beef units. So the solid line is a dairy unit and the dashed line is a beef unit. And these are two different species here. So this species, we'll just call it species 1 up here and species 2 up here. And so what you really want you to focus on is the fact that they're not present over the whole period of the year, and whether it's a beef unit or a dairy unit will change which dung beetles you have. And so really I was trying to find information on dung beetles in Kansas and came up with nothing, which was unfortunate, but also fortunate because it gives us something to do. So Herman over here, poor Herman, I was like, hey Herman, let's go collect some dung beetles. Can you figure this out? And so he figured out how to collect them, and that's a picture of him and the traps. And this is a trap that we just pulled out. We've got 4 out back here, and there's tons of beetles in it. And these are the beetles that we collected. And so we use some pig manure. They really like pig manure. And so if you go out as you leave on the box with the tables where you registered, there's a box there that shows you what our trap looks like, so if you want to take a look. And we will also put this out here so you can see what the beetles look like. Basically, we just we take 2 cups and stack them on, and then we pour some water in and some soap, and then we collect some beetles. And so this is kind of who we're finding. So the bottom one here, these are those dwellers that you'll see really small, but the top 2 are the little rollers, and they roll things away. And so this guy is not commonly found in this area. This originally was in the eastern part of the United States, but it has also been found in Nebraska. So we have it now, and this one doesn't roll the dung very far away from the pat, so it will just go next to the pat. But who we really are finding are these canthons, and if you look into here, you'll see a ton of little canthon beetles, and they're really, really fantastic. There's a bunch of different species found all across the United States, and what they do is they roll the manure quite a far distance away from the pat. Okay, so what we really need is a better understanding about what really impacts their health. We've got fewer dung beetles than we should have, so we should have a lot more dung beetles. What we do know is that macrocyclic lactones, so the compounds that you're giving to deworm, can have an effect on these, the grubs, the larval stage of these dung beetles, for up to a month after it's been administered. And the results, the research is a little bit ambiguous. We can't quite figure out how bad it is or how long this effect is there for, but there is no doubt that the things that we're doing are negatively impacting them. Our feed-through insect growth regulators, it depends on which kind you use and what concentration. But again, we don't have proper in-the-field research that can show us how much we're impacting our populations. And so once we know who we have in Kansas, what we really want to do is start developing some sort of metrics to say, okay, well, if I forego treating with macrocyclic lactones, how can I expect my worm burdens to be? How can I expect my dung beetle populations to be? And how long does it take for this ecosystem to self-manage itself? And so this is research that we'll hopefully get to further down the line. Right now, we're just trying to figure out who we even have. So what can you do to help? There was a catch. I'm trying to get you guys involved in helping me out here. So on that table out there is a piece of paper. Next year, what we want to do is surveys, and so what we would like to do is to just bury some cups on your pastures and collect your beetles. The great stuff is you'll find out which beetles you have. What we do need is for you guys to be super honest. So you know when you go to the doctor and they say, oh, you've been exercising? Yeah, I've been exercising tons, 3-4 times a week. Drinking? No, maybe a glass of wine on Sunday, but that's about it. What we really need is for you guys to be absolutely honest, because if we've got any chance of figuring out who we have and what impacts why our dung beetles do what they do, we need to know exactly what you guys are doing. So if you're interested in getting involved, please put your name down and we'll get in touch with you. We do know that macrocyclic lactones are bad for the beetles, so if you can, don't treat all animals all the time, only treat animals who need it. So those younger animals who aren't doing so well. This is good for resistance, but also good for the beetles. Main thing, do not be all excited about this talk and be like, yeah, I'm going to get some dung beetles. I'm going to go onto the Google, dung beetles for sale, get me some dung beetles. The dung beetles that they sell you are not the dung beetles that are native to Kansas. They're dung beetles that can grow really well in a lab. And they're dung beetles from my part of the world. I'm from South Africa. We have this dung beetle over here, phenomenal dung beetle, just the best of the best of the best, because we have elephants roaming around. Like, that's a lot of poop. So they're really, really, really great dung beetles, but they displace your native dung beetles. So you really want to avoid bringing in dung beetles that aren't native. And this is what happens. This is that same paper I talked about. Here it is. Here's our invasive dung beetle right here. So it was present. So this is somebody who was well-meaning, wanted to get some dung beetles, brought one of these dung beetles in. They've absolutely overtaken Australia. So don't buy any dung beetles off the internet. Partner with us, and we'll find out who you have and what you can do to get better. And so I don't even know how much time I have because I didn't take note. But I'm going to end with a fun fact. Has anybody ever been curious why the ancient Egyptians were so obsessed with scarab beetles? A few of them are colorful, so I get that, but like, that they worship scarab beetles, these little beetles? I mean, you've got crocodiles, and you've got lions, you've got all these things. You're going to put beetles on everything? I'm an entomologist, I like bugs, and I'm not even putting beetles on things. I was listening to an audiobook, and I've always been interested in ancient Egypt, so he was talking about, and he said the same thing. Why did they think that these dung beetles were so sacred? And basically, because they only ever saw the adult beetles, right? And there's no sex differentiation. Unless you're an entomologist, you can't tell a male from a female. They never saw the immature stages because they were always underground. So they thought these were miraculous creatures that just reappeared. So they were sacred because you never saw the babies. So that's why they are sacred, because they were a sign of rebirth. So ancient Egyptians loved them, we love them. Hopefully, in the next few years, we'll know a lot more about them in Kansas and what we can do to promote dung beetle health.